Anastasia, the barber chair. Execution. Anastasia, head of the notorious Mangano crime family, met one of the most shocking deaths in Mafia history. In 1957, while relaxing in a barber's chair at the Park Sheraton Hotel in Manhattan, two masked gunmen stormed in. Without warning, they fired a hail of bullets, striking Anastasia multiple times. Disoriented, he reportedly lunged at the mirror, thinking it was his attackers. The brutality of his death sent shockwaves through New York's underworld. To be killed while so vulnerable and in such a public setting was both humiliating and terrifying, a warning that no position of power could protect even the most feared mob bosses from sudden, painful execution. Paul Castellano, the Sparks Steakhouse hit. Paul Castellano, boss of the Gambino family, believed himself untouchable. But in 1985, he learned otherwise in front of Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan. As Castellano stepped from his car, he and his driver were suddenly gunned down in broad daylight by shooters acting under John Gotti's orders. Castellano never even made it inside the restaurant. His death was humiliating, killed on the open street in full public view with no chance to fight back. For a man who had controlled millions and commanded one of the largest mafia families in America, dying in such a bloody, helpless way was a painful end that shattered his legacy. Joe Masseria betrayed at dinner. In 1931, Joe Masseria, known as Joe the Boss, thought he was dining with allies at a Coney Island restaurant. But in reality, it was a setup orchestrated by his own lieutenant, Charles Lucky Luciano. While Masseria enjoyed a game of cards, gunmen stormed in and unleashed a storm of bullets. Luciano himself quietly excused to the restroom moments earlier, leaving Masseria defenseless. The betrayal cut deeper than the bullets. Masseria died realizing his trusted inner circle had turned on him. For a mafia boss, being assassinated during a friendly dinner by those you elevated was one of the most painful ways to go. Carmine Galante, Cigars and Gunfire. Carmine Galante, boss of the Bonanno family, was feared for his brutality and drug empire. But in 1979, his reign ended violently in a Brooklyn restaurant. While enjoying lunch and puffing on his trademark cigar, masked gunmen stormed the patio. Galante was shot multiple times at close range, collapsing onto the ground, cigar still clenched between his teeth. The image of his corpse, photographed with smoke lingering around his mouth, became one of the most iconic mafia death scenes. His end was as painful as it was symbolic. A man who lived ruthlessly and died with no mercy, silenced in the middle of an ordinary meal. Salvatore Maranzano, the first boss of bosses. Salvatore Maranzano, considered the first true boss of bosses in New York, believed he had outmaneuvered rivals by defeating Joe Masseria. But just months later in 1931, Luciano struck again. Maranzano was lured into his office, where he was brutally stabbed and shot multiple times by Luciano's hitmen disguised as federal agents. The viciousness of his death shocked even the underworld. Stabbing a mafia boss to death was an act designed not just to kill, but to humiliate and terrify. Maranzano's painful end marked the beginning of a new era, with Luciano's commission replacing the title of Boss of Bosses forever. Angelo Bruno, the Gentle Don's brutal end. Angelo Bruno, boss of the Philadelphia crime family, was known as the Gentle Don for his preference for diplomacy over violence. But in 1980, his peaceful image ended with a shotgun blast to the back of his head while sitting in his car outside his home. The assassination was ordered by his own underlings, tired of his conservative leadership. The attack was sudden, personal, and merciless. Bruno died instantly, his face shattered by the blast. For a man who had ruled by avoiding bloodshed, dying in such a gruesome fashion highlighted the cruel irony of mafia life. Even the most measured leaders are not spared brutal exits. Stefano Magaddino, bomb by betrayal. Stefano Magaddino, once the powerful boss of Buffalo, controlled operations stretching into Canada. But his later years were plagued with betrayal. In 1974, while relaxing at home, a hidden bomb was planted under his porch by those seeking revenge. The blast ripped through his body, leaving him mutilated and suffering before death. Unlike quick executions by gunfire, Magaddino's end was gruesome and agonizing. His home turned into a death trap. For a man who once projected power and control, being blown apart by hidden explosives was not only painful, but a complete destruction of his feared image. Frank Costello, the bullet that failed. Frank Costello, known as the Prime Minister of the Underworld, was targeted in 1957 by rival Vito Genovese. As Costello entered his Manhattan apartment building, hitman Vincent Gigante shot him in the head at close range. Miraculously, the bullet only grazed his scalp. Though he survived, the attempt left him deeply shaken. Costello retired from mafia life immediately afterward, knowing that surviving an assassination was sometimes worse than dying. The constant fear, paranoia, and humiliation of having your power stripped by one failed shot was a painful psychological death for a man who once held near political control of the mafia. Bugsy Siegel, the Flamingo Casino Curse. Bugsy Siegel, the flashy mobster behind the Las Vegas Flamingo Hotel, thought he was building a gambling empire, but his reckless spending and arrogance angered his mafia investors. In 1947, while reading a newspaper at his girlfriend's home in Beverly Hills, Siegel was ambushed through the window. A volley of rifle shots tore through his body and face, leaving him mutilated instantly. His glamorous Hollywood lifestyle ended in seconds. The gruesome murder not only ended Siegel's life, but also sent a message that the mafia would never forgive financial recklessness. The violent nature of his death cemented him as one of the most infamous mafia casualties. Giovanni Brusca, burned by his own legacy. Giovanni Brusca, the ruthless Sicilian boss, known for his role in blowing up Judge Giovanni Falcone in 1992, faced an ironic and painful downfall. While not executed in classic mob fashion, his capture in 1996 brought him disgrace, and his eventual death in prison years later was marked by isolation and suffering. Shunned even by fellow mobsters for his cruelty, he once admitted to dissolving a child's body in acid. Brusca's demise was slow and agonizing, not by bullets but by the weight of his own brutality. In mafia terms, dying hated, abandoned, and forgotten is often considered more painful than any execution. Vincent Chin Gigante. The prison death. Vincent Gigante, known as the Odd Father for wandering Greenwich Village in a bathrobe, pretending to be insane, fooled courts for decades. But behind the act, he was a ruthless boss of the Genovese family. Eventually convicted in the 1990s, Gigante spent his final years behind bars, stripped of power and dignity. In 2005, he died in prison from heart disease, frail and forgotten. For a man who once commanded fear across New York, slowly wasting away behind steel bars, watched, powerless, and mocked for his insanity act, was a painfully humiliating end. In the mafia world, dying weak and caged is one of the worst punishments imaginable. Michele the Cobra. Greco, alone in his cell. Michele Greco, infamous boss of the Sicilian Mafia, was once feared as a master manipulator who ordered countless brutal killings. But when Italy launched its maxi trial against the Mafia in the 1980s, Greco was condemned to life behind bars. His empire collapsed, his allies betrayed him, and his family distanced themselves from the shame of his crimes. In 2008, he died alone in a prison hospital suffering from cancer. Unlike the violent deaths of others, his was slow, painful, and drawn out. A man once worshipped reduced to weakness and obscurity. For mafia bosses, obscurity is worse than bloodshed, making Greco's Lionel Fra Francesco Abadamarco, nicknamed Frankie Shots, was a feared Brooklyn mobster who had run lucrative gambling operations. But his greed and arrogance earned him enemies within his own family. In 1959, while sitting at his kitchen table in Brooklyn, he was ambushed by fellow gangsters. They riddled his body with bullets, leaving him bleeding out in his own home. What made his death especially painful was the betrayal. Men he trusted and worked alongside plotted his execution. To die in your own kitchen, surrounded not by rivals but by supposed allies, showed how fragile mafia loyalty really was. His murder reminded the underworld that bet,